Let me first compliment Mr. Chandrabhushan and iForest for these two wonderful reports on just transition framework for India, uh, and one on policies, plans, and institutional mechanisms, and one is a decomposition study. And these will go a long way in giving us a better understanding and a much better comprehension on how to undertake a just transition in India, and also give us a global perspective of what's happening across the world at both the national and subnational level. Uh, I've been a long term believer that just transition is not just about phasing down of fossil fuel infrastructure, it's also about jobs, it's also about growth, and it's also about sustainability. It's also important to understand that electricity in India is just 20% of our energy requirement. And even if we were to do 100% renewable, 80% of our energy comes from hard to abate sectors like refinery, steel, cement, long distance transport, which are very critical. Now, most of us in the emerging markets also realize that we are not responsible for carbonizing the world. If the world has to limit itself to 1.5 degrees centigrade, we are running out of space, carbon space, and therefore it's imperative that all of us undertake just transition. While we've not contributed to carbonizing the world, it's also important that in due course India will become, we occupy just 1.5% of the carbon space out of the 2,800 gigatons of carbon space available. We occupy just 1.5 at 1.5 degree centigrade. We occupy just 1.5%. Logically, India should be entitled to about 18.5% based on its per capita. But irrespective of that, as we industrialize, we'll soon become the third most carbonizing country in the world. And therefore, the challenge for India is to become the first country in the world to industrialize without carbonizing. That is a challenge which India has taken upon itself, both at COP21 in Paris and later in the vision of the Prime Minister through Panchamrit in Glasgow. We are also the first country which was able to achieve its NDC target 9 years ahead of schedule. We do about 172 gigawatts of renewable. And while we are pushing for all this, it's also important to understand that it will not be politically feasible, as Mr. Chandrabhushan has said, because it impacts jobs and livelihoods. In many of these areas, unless, to my mind, we are not able to economically drive down the prices of renewables very sharply. And that would mean that, to my mind, access to the best possible technologies and our ability to source funding at low rates of interest. So, my belief is that India is climatically blessed. No other country in the world, other than probably Saudi Arabia or one or two other countries, have the similar kind of climatic conditions as India has. So, India has a huge potential for doing renewables. But I was analyzing the bid of Saudi Arabia. Our lowest bid has been 0.02 kilowatt per hour. Saudi Arabia got, when comparative terms you look at it, Saudi got even a lower bid than that. And I was analyzing these two bids. The only difference between Saudi's much lower bid and India's bid was the rate of interest. In Saudi, it was dollar denominated tariff at 1.5%. In India, it was at about 8.5%. So the challenge to my mind is our ability to source funding at lower rates of interest, because India's climatic conditions are very good and India's entrepreneurship is top class. They will drive the just transition. The private sector of India will drive the just transition as they've done in renewables. But our ability, they will go and get the best technology as they've done in many other areas, and they've done it in renewables, they're doing it in green hydrogen. But our ability to get financing at low cost is a key component there. And there the challenge is that the developed world, which had committed to $100 billion a year in 2009, has not lived up to its commitments at all. But irrespective of that, there's no shortage of funds to my mind. There are vast pools of institutional funds available. There are insurance funds, pension funds, all of them want to invest. And actually, I'm a believer that values of companies and values of countries and the ability to attract capital will go up only if they go digital and go green. And therefore, we should push, and we are pushing, and our young enterprise is all pushing for it, but our ability to attract private capital is greatly impacted. Our ability to push for just transition gets badly impacted because the risks of sourcing private fund in Asia, in Africa, are very different from the risks in the developed part of the world. And therefore, it's important to pool these risks together and also to be able to bring in new instruments of lending, whether it's blended finance, whether it's credit enhancement, whether it's first loss guarantees. And I think, therefore, I'm a believer that if you want to push the South and the emerging markets towards just transition, it's very important that the multilateral financial institutions and all these other institutions were created. They were created in the post-World War II era, the post-Bretton Woods period. They're not designed for climate change, nor are they designed for SDG goals. And therefore, you need these institutions to do more of indirect financing rather than direct financing, and must be able to leverage their equity base for much greater level of financing to be able to assist and support entrepreneurs and enable them to be able to bring down the cost of just transition. Without their ability to bring down the cost of just transition, it will be very difficult, even if you push for all these policy measures, even if the government pushes for all these policy measures. So I'm a great believer that the ability to provide low-cost financing over a long period of time, because hedging instruments are not available. They're available for 2-3 years. You need hedging instruments of about 25 to 30 years, which is very critical. And even if we do 100% renewable on our electricity, it's the balance 80% of the hard to abate sectors, which is very critical. And unless we do about 180 billion worth of fossil fuel imports, and the last slide which Mr. Chandrabhushan brought out is about making India fossil fuel independent, which the Prime Minister talked about in his independence speech last year. And the way forward for that, and the way forward is much like the development of the world was driven by coal and by oil in the last century. The development of the emerging markets has to be driven by a completely new fuel, which is green hydrogen. And for that to happen, you need to bring down the cost of renewables, to my mind, to almost about 50% of its present lowest bids which have come in India. And then to be able to make a country like India the lowest cost producer, the lowest exporter of green hydrogen in its liquid form, ammonia, to the rest of the world. And there, to my mind, India has great opportunity, not only because it has great climatic conditions, but because it has great capacity and capability to do pump storage. I'm a believer that the answer to the lowest cost of producing green hydrogen lies in your ability to combine wind, solar, and pump storage together. Pump storage, because the cost of production of 24 into 7 renewables with storage, it then becomes about 40% cheaper than battery storage. You're not import dependent on lithium, nickel, and cobalt. And India has huge geography to do pump storage on a very large scale through private sector. And therefore, wind, solar combined with pump storage is really the answer to bringing down the cost of green hydrogen to $2.5 per kilogram in the next 3 years, and bringing it down to $1 per kilogram in the next by 2030. And that is really the alternative to a new fuel for the world. And that is the answer for just transition, to my mind. But let me tell you that will not happen. That will not happen simply because the Western part of the world, which has advocated free trade for a long time through its Inflation Reduction Act and CHIP Act, have produced the most protectionist piece of literature ever written in the world. And the Inflation Reduction Act talks about giving $3 per kilogram subsidy to green hydrogen produced in the United States of America, as long as you make it in the United States of America, even if the cost of production in the United States of America is $7.5 per kilogram as compared to $4.5 per kilogram in India. And therefore, this is not, you need to open up, talk about, these are countries which have talked about globalization. These are countries which have talked about free trade and are preaching and are actually implementing protectionism as far as new fuels of the world are concerned and as far as decarbonizing the world are concerned. And therefore, just transition cannot take place as far as these countries practice protectionism instead of free trade. And these, to my mind, requires a very open mind for opening up the world to produce green hydrogen at the lowest cost, bring down the cost of renewables, demonopolize supplies, ensure that the cost of production falls very rapidly, because size and scale is important, and only size and scale will enable just transition to take place. And therefore, to my mind, in emerging markets like India, it's about jobs, it's about growth, it's about sustainability. We are blessed with climatic conditions. We have top-class entrepreneurship. We can do it. But I think you need a global structural reforms for financing, and you need to move away from protectionism to be able to enable it to do it. Thank you.